So welcome to your next video entitled The Fighting Begins, but the US remains neutral. In the last video we covered the causes of World War I, but in this video we're going to be talking about some of the things dealing with World War I prior to the US actually entering. So let's get started. The big thing that you're going to have to know about World War I is the technology that leads to a stalemate. So a stalemate is when it's basically like a tie. No one is winning, no one's really losing. You're just kind of butting heads and nothing is really happening. And the main reason that you have a stalemate during World War I is because of trench warfare. So when the German soldiers invaded neutral Belgium and they moved into France to try to take over Paris, they were obviously met by the French and the British soldiers. And that battle is known as the Battle of the Marne, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But after this battle, the Germans decided that they're going to settle onto the high ground and they're going to dig their trenches and they're going to fortify their position. And the French and the British decided that they are also going to do the same. So they dig their own trenches and they use machine guns and different kinds of artillery to basically kill thousands of Germans or British and French soldiers. Soon you had over 450 miles of trenches that stretched from Belgium to the border of Switzerland, and these trenches were very intricate. And this is known as the Western Front. So the Western Front in France became the critical battlefield. Basically, the side that was able to win here in the Western Front was a side that was going to win the war in general. So trench warfare is a type of fighting that occurred during World War I, in which both sides dug trenches to protect themselves by mines and barbed wire. And the land in between both sides of the trenches, so you had like the Germans on one side and the British and the French on the other, the land in the middle was known as no man's land. And the chart all the way down at the bottom, you had the different types of technology that was available and like what they did. So you have, like the submarines, which we'll talk about. You have the poison gas, which became a big thing during World War I. You had obviously the machine guns, which could fire 600 bullets per minute, the tanks, the airplanes. So you had lots of different technology come into play, but again, trench warfare was kind of the big thing. Now, trenches were not fun. And if you guys look at the very tippy top, you're going to see two quotes, and they're quotes from soldiers that fought in trenches. And it says, "The rats were huge. They were so big that they would eat a wounded man if he couldn't defend himself. I saw rats running from under dead men's greatcoats, enormous rats, fat with human flesh." So trenches were not fun places to be in. And here are some pictures from the trenches. Now, the stalemate led to gruesome conditions for men. The soldiers were battling very harsh conditions, as well as battling their enemies, obviously. And they developed something called trench foot, which is right in the middle, down toward the bottom. So trench foot comes from basically standing for hours in wet, muddy trenches. And that's what basically happens when your feet spend hours and hours and hours and hours in the water. They also contracted lice from the millions of rats that infested the trenches. They would dig into the ground, the trenches were dug into the ground, and the soldiers were living in constant fear that if they popped their head up, that they would get shot by their enemy. And so they were always afraid to pop their heads up out of their holes, not necessarily knowing what was going to happen. You also had, on the top right corner, where it says an aerial photograph of the opposing trenches, you can see trenches on both sides, and this is in France. The Germans are on the right, Frenches are on the top, the British are on the top left, and you see that land in the middle. That land in the middle is known as no man's land. If you go to the picture right next to it, right in the middle on the top, you can see the soldiers are firing into the opposite trenches, and you see the dead bodies that are there. That's no man's land. You wouldn't get out of your trench to try to get these or try to retrieve these people, because then you would be putting your own life at risk. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the two soldiers that are walking in muddy conditions. So one possibility of something that they could develop is trench foot. Casualty or soldiers killed or wounded and wounded or missing mounted first in the thousands, then the hundreds of thousands, and then finally in the millions. Almost 1 million French soldiers were killed or wounded in just the first 3 months of the war, and Germany lost only slightly fewer. Although gas masks were soon developed to counter poison gas attacks were still pretty horrifying to soldiers. This was the first war that poison gas was really used in. The war dragged on for years, 4 years total, and it was very, very deadly, more deadly than anyone really expected it to be. And the primary reason for the length of this war, the fact that it went on for 4 years, is the fact that you had better defensive weapons, and they were much more devastating, basically, than the offensive ones were. So in virtually every battle on the Western Front, the attacking force is the one that would end up suffering terribly. Even the use of poison gas did nothing to benefit the offense, despite the horrifying effects of poison gas. Ineffective offenses and effective defenses is what basically produced this deadly stalemate. So if you were talking about trench warfare and you have one side coming out of their trenches and racing toward the enemy's trenches, the enemy is in their trench and they could just fire until they all basically die. So the offense is the one that's going to suffer, not the defense. And that's part of the reason why the military casualties were so high. Now I want you guys to look down at the painting in the bottom right called Gassed. And it was painted right at the end of World War I. But what is the meaning of this painting? Now, this is a pretty unique thing that happened during World War I. And during the first year, 1914, beginning late Christmas Eve, both sides decided that they were just going to kind of stop fighting for Christmas Day. So it was known as the Christmas Truce, where British and German troops sang to each other, they even exchanged gifts, and they even had a soccer match from opposite sides. And during December 25th, 1914, there was no war. The soldiers were friendly and everything was okay. However, on December 26th in 1914, the war was back on and the once friendly troops were now enemies again. In that picture in the top right, you can see the British and the German soldiers standing together. And the British guy is one that has the helmet that has the point on. And then behind them, the German guy is one that has the helmet with the point on. And then behind them are the British soldiers. But no one was killed on December 25th on Christmas Day. And this was something that was pretty unique. In 2008, the soldiers that were still alive that actually participated in the Christmas truce went back and reenacted the game and the singing and the tradition or the gift exchange that they had in the very same location. Now, President Wilson is urging neutrality. Kind of. Now, one reason why President Wilson was urging neutrality is the fact that the U.S. is a melting pot. We have Americans from all different origins, from all different countries, and Wilson did not want to see the war basically pin Americans against each other. 1/3 of Americans at this time were foreign born, and many of these immigrants considered themselves to be, German Americans or Irish Americans or Polish Americans, and they sided with their country back in Europe. Now, the Americans that had been here for generations didn't really have an opinion about World War I. They just kind of viewed this as an issue in Europe. They were fighting for land, they were fighting for power, and that America should really just stay out of it. Now, officially, the U.S. was a neutral country, yes, but we traded food, weapons, oil, steel, and other goods far more with the Allied powers than we did with the Central Powers. If you're looking at the top left corner, you're going to see that our exports started to rise, like crazy, because we were trading a lot more with Britain and with France than we were, for example, with Germany. Now, one thing that starts to occur early on in the war are blockades. So the British would set up blockades around the German coasts, and the Germans would set up blockades around the British coasts. early in the war, when they decided to do this, if they were to capture a ship, if the British were to capture a German ship, for example, they were allowed to confiscate contraband. And contraband is usually like weapons or anything that could be used to fight a war. So they could confiscate it legally, and it's okay. But the non-contraband goods, like food or medical supplies, you're supposed to let that go. That's okay. Now, what happens with these blockades is that Germany was not necessarily playing by the rules. And so when Britain set up a blockade around Germany, they decided that they were going to begin sinking Allied ships using U-boats. And a U-boat is basically a submarine. And so these U-boats would torpedo enemy ships and neutral ships that were trading with the enemy. So if you're looking right in the middle of the page, the ships that are sunk by the U-boats, you can see all those little red dots. Those are all ships that were sunk by the Germans, by the German U-boat. And if you look down right underneath, that's a German submarine. It's a German U-boat. So the U.S. was neutral, but we were trading more with the Allies. And you ran the risk of having your boat basically getting shot down, or basically getting torpedoed, I should say, by a German U-boat, because the Germans didn't like the fact that the British were setting up blockades around their own ports. Now, this leads up to something else, but before we get into that, I want you to take a second and look at the political cartoon up above. Let's think. The question of neutrality. And take a look at this picture, answer the 2 questions below, and then keep going. Now, here are 2 pictures of ships that were damaged by U-boats. So basically, they were damaged by torpedoes. The one that's on the bottom was actually a hospital ship. So they didn't really play by the rules of whether it was contraband or non-contraband. They just sunk anything, which of course angers the U.S. So the reality of the German blockade struck America on May 7, 1915, when a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. So German officials correctly claimed that the ship was carrying ammunition and other contrabands that they could have seized, but it was an unarmed and an unresisting ship. It was a passenger line. These people it was basically like a cruise boat. So why would they just randomly shoot it down without being warned to provide safety for its passengers? You had over 1,200 people that were killed. President Wilson is stunned, but he still wanted peace. So Germany helps to keep the U.S. out of the war by promising to not sink any more passenger ships. Now, why would we believe Germany? They kept this promise up until 1916, when Germany ends up sinking an unarmed French passenger ship called the Sussex. Another storm of protests comes up in America. How can Germany be sinking these ships when they're unarmed? It has innocent people on there. And Germany again promises to not sink unarmed ships. That promise, called the Sussex Pledge, would not last long either. But I want you to take a look at the cartoon that's right next to it, the Let's Think, because you have a sinking ship that's supposed to represent the Lusitania, and it says U.S. Patience on it. And then you have like a little submarine telescope thing kind of looking at it. So what is the message behind this political cartoon? Now, with the sinking of the Lusitania, obviously America was angered by it and the fact that you had innocent people that were being killed. But President Wilson still wanted to remain at peace, even though he realized that this was probably not possible. And so he decides that he is going to prepare the nation for war. Now, many Americans believe that preparing themselves for war could be dangerous because it could actually provoke war. But even so, Congress passes 2 pieces of legislation in 1916 to prepare for the possibility of U.S. involvement. And here are the 2 things that Congress passed. So he passed the National Defense Act, which expanded the size of the Army, and then the Naval Construction Act, which was the ordering of more warships, basically. In 1916, President Wilson was also running for re-election, and the slogan that he uses, "He kept us out of the war." It was a close election. Wilson had a very narrow victory, but he did win. And he still wanted peace, but he was prepping for war just in case. Now, America enters the war, kind of, because the war kind of comes to us. In January of 1917, after suffering lots of supply shortages due to the blockade, Germany is going to take action. And the first thing that Germany does is they have their foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, send a telegram to Mexico. And this telegram basically asks Mexico to have or to start an alliance with them, so that if the U.S. declares war on Germany, Mexico should declare war on the U.S. Now, the reason why Germany did this was to try to keep the U.S. involved here. Like the U.S., if the U.S. were to declare war on Germany and then Mexico declared war on the U.S. wouldn't be able to focus very much on what was going on in Europe because they would have to fight Mexico here. Now, Germany told Mexico that after, the Germans won, Mexico would get back the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which they lost back in 1848 after the end of the Mexican-American War. The telegram, though, was intercepted by the British, and the British gave it to the American authorities. So it never actually made it to the hands of Mexico. So that was the first thing that Germany did when they were upset that they had very severe supply shortages due to the blockade. The second thing was that Germany is saying that they're going to have unrestricted submarine warfare against Britain. So they didn't care what the ship was, who was on the ship, what it was carrying. They were basically going to torpedo every ship and all ships. They didn't care anymore. So that's the violation of the Sussex Pledge, which we spoke about a couple of seconds ago. Although most people knew that Mexico had no intention of attacking the U.S., the U.S. was shocked that they would even do this. And even Wilson could no longer call for peace. So on April 2nd, 1917, he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. Congress responded just 4 days later on April 6, 1917, with a declaration for war, and Wilson's long struggle to keep America at peace was over. This is the actual Zimmermann note. So on the top left, you have, all the little codes that was decoded into figuring out what they actually said. And then down at the bottom is the actual telegram once it was decoded. Now here are the 11 questions that you should be able to answer. I know you had a lot of information, so just make sure that you're able to answer these 11 questions. And otherwise, I will see you guys tomorrow in class.